we are having a behavioral economist, a well-known behavioral economist, the author of Nudge, Professor Ken Sunstein, right from Harvard. Dr. Sunstein has testified before the congressional committees on many subjects, and he has advised officials at the United Nations, the European Commission, the World Bank, and many nations on issues of law and public policy. He served as advisor to the Behavioral Insights team in United Kingdom. We welcome Professor Sunstein to this lecture. Over to you, Dr. Nadeem.
Thank you very, very much. It is a great honor to be with you in this way. I wish I could be with you in person, and I hope to at some point, but I'm very grateful to be able to be there in this way. In these remarks, I'm going to be giving, in some ways, an overview of behavioral economics, behavioral science, and public policy, but I'm going to try to introduce, at times, some new concepts that we are beginning to understand. Some of them will be, despite their novelty, new to you. Despite their novelty and new to you, they will be in the discussion at this event, I'm aware, so you will know them. Here are the three ideas that have a degree of novelty. The first is scarcity. And by this, I do not mean economic scarcity, I mean cognitive scarcity, scarcity in the mind. All of us, like a computer, have limited processing power in our mind. And if we are sick or poor or elderly, or suffering from some sort of incapacity, our processing power will be reduced. We've spent a great deal of time in the last 100 years or more on economic scarcity, and that's very important. We need to spend a great deal of time in the next 100 years on cognitive scarcity and its importance. And I'll be bringing that to bear on concrete issues in a moment. The second concept is sludge. And here the idea is that administrative burdens, reporting requirements, paperwork requirements, waiting time, in-person appearance requirements, and much more often operate as a kind of wall between human beings and something that can make their lives better. What we need all over the world is a sludge audit in which we quantify, to the extent we can, the magnitude of sludge. And the beauty of sludge audits is that they often provide a foundation for sludge reduction. The third concept has to do with social norms. This is the third new concept. And while we've known for a very long time that social norms are important in behavior, what we're learning is that if people learn that there is a new or emerging social norm, that people are increasingly wearing masks or increasingly stopping smoking cigarettes or increasingly driving carefully, or increasingly reducing the environmental impact of their behavior, that can be as important as knowing what the existing norm is. Knowledge of the emerging norm can often be very important in changing behavior. So the three ideas that are new involve scarcity, sludge, and emerging social norms. To orient these remarks, here's some data from all over the world. If people are automatically enrolled in savings programs, the level of participation in savings programs increases dramatically, even if people can easily and freely opt out. So one design, people are asked, do you want to enroll in savings programs? The participation rate isn't tiny, but it isn't huge. The other design, people are automatically enrolled and asked whether they want to opt out. The consequence of that is dramatically to increase participation rates. That's all over the world. The second bit of data comes from North America, And the problem is that many children are poor, even in wealthy nations. There are programs available that allow those children to receive free school meals. Many of the parents do not enroll the children in the programs that could give them free, nutritious lunch and breakfast. The Nudge initiative is automatically to certify poor children as eligible. And according to recent data, the effect of that is to give free school meals to 15 million poor children. 15 million poor children. The third bit of data involves debt, and in particular, debt on credit cards. This is a problem in many nations. People spend without sufficient care. One law gives people clarity about the consequence of spending in excess of their credit limit or of not paying on time. And the result of a law that has various interventions of that sort is to reduce credit card debt by billions of dollars, to save consumers billions of dollars. The last example involves climate change. This has been much in the news. In various countries, the response to greenhouse gas emissions is automatically to enroll certain businesses and certain individuals in cleaner sources of energy, like solar and wind. Not everyone, but a lot of people are automatically enrolled. They can shift to coal if they like, but they are nudged. The consequence in Switzerland and Germany in particular has been dramatically to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it looks as if the environmental impact is significant and its benefits greatly outweigh its costs. Those are some examples. Now what I'm going to do is shift to three brief discussions. The first has to do with humanity, and this is our species. This cuts across national boundaries. There doesn't seem to be significant differences along the dimensions I'm going to be describing between people in Mexico and people in France, between people in Pakistan and people in China. This is humanity. Then I'm going to discuss behavior change generally, and I'm going to give a little framework for behavior change, and then I'm going to shift with sludge. Okay, with respect to humanity, we know that human beings are imperfect choosers. Sometimes some behavioral scientists say that human beings are irrational. It's probably good to avoid that unkind phrase. It's not very nice to describe people as irrational, and it's not true to say that people are irrational. At least most of us aren't quite irrational. But it is true to say that we are imperfect choosers. That's a better description. The fact that we are imperfect choosers is manifested in 5 principal findings in behavioral science. The first is human beings tend on average to be unrealistically optimistic. This isn't the worst thing to be optimistic. It has various benefits, but it can create serious problems. 90% of people, according to one study, believe that they are safer than the average driver. 94% of college professors, according to one study, believe that they are better than the average college professors. And while I haven't conducted this study, I believe that 100% of people believe that their sense of humor is better than the average sense of humor. Unrealistic optimism can create health and safety and economic problems. We know, second, that human beings tend to focus on today and tomorrow, and the future tends to be a foreign country, let's call it later land, and they're not sure they're ever going to visit. If we focus on today and tomorrow and not the future, not 5 years from now or 10 years from now, we can get into serious economic trouble, and we can make decisions that will impair our health. And if we're struggling from poverty, we might not make choices that can help us struggle less from poverty. Unrealistic optimism and present bias are a terrible combination. They can lead people to make choices that do not make their lives go better. We know, third, that human beings tend to suffer from inertia. We procrastinate. That means that the status quo has a great deal of force. And if we could make a simple decision that would change our lives for the better, often we won't because of the magnetic force of the status quo. We know, fourth, that human beings have limited attention. And this may be the most important feature of our minds of all, that of the assortment of things that we could see, even at this very moment, each of us is seeing only a subset. I hope you're looking at me, but there are a lot of things happening in the room that do not involve me, and you are not paying attention to them. I can promise that there are a lot of things happening in the little room from which I am speaking, and I am focusing only on these remarks and you. That limited attention is often a very good thing, but for a consumer, making choices about what to buy, for a student, making choices about what to study, for an employee, making choices about what to do that day, limited attention can mean that people ignore something that really affects their welfare. Finally, we know that in assessing risks, people often make judgments by asking about which risks come to mind. Decades after the Spanish flu and the pandemic, people were not focused on the risk of a pandemic because they couldn't think of one. In the aftermath of a terrible event, that particular event will drive people's judgments about probability, perhaps inflate their judgment about probability. And when a terrible event hasn't occurred in the recent past, people's fear may become complacency, and that can be a problem. So the assortment of features of humanity include unrealistic optimism, present bias, inertia, limited attention, and imperfect risk perception. Nudges are often a response to behavioral biases of the sort just described, and the central characteristic of nudges, as I hope is familiar, is that they preserve freedom of choice. So a GPS device is a nudge. You can tell yourself that the GPS device is giving you a route that you like less than the route that's familiar, and you'll take your familiar route. You also are entitled to program the GPS to tell you where you want to go. And that means the GPS device respects your choice about where to go and also allows you to override its own nudge. But it is immensely helpful. Nudges tend to involve education or architecture. A warning is a nudge. A reminder by text message is a nudge. An information disclosure about something that matters with respect to food or employment or safety, those are nudges. Evidence of social norms are also nudges. And evidence of social norms, as emphasized, often can be particularly powerful if people learn that people are increasingly engaging in certain behavior. Knowledge that behavior is more and more popular, let's call it virtuous behavior or safe behavior or healthy behavior, that can often make for a self-fulfilling prophecy. Some nudges are architectural. They do not educate people. If people are automatically enrolled in some kind of program, they might not learn anything. They just are in the program. And on average, automatic enrollment has been found to increase participation by 26%. It's a powerful nudge. It doesn't teach people anything necessarily. If people are asked, do you want to participate in a program? If people are told you can't work here unless you make a choice, that is a nudge. That is not automatic enrollment. It is architectural, and it can often drive behavior. If a grocery store or an online seller has a certain font or certain kind of music or certain order, that is often going to nudge people. The order nudges people. Okay, that's humanity with a note on nudge. There's a lot of work going on that tries to systematize the empirical work we've had over the past 30 years, including some very interesting work for the past 5 years. And the current acronym for the empirical work is 5 letters, and it's FEAST, F-E-A-S-T. And each of the letters is designed to capture dozens of research findings about human behavior. Let's start, shall we, with the E in FEAST. And the basic idea is if you want to change behavior, the first thing you should do is make it easy. With respect to vaccination, in some communities, a very controversial matter, whether we're speaking of COVID-19 or something else. With respect to vaccination, I've worked with the World Health Organization now for a number of months, and the experts there say that to overcome the problem of vaccine hesitancy and to increase vaccine acceptance, the first thing to do is make it very easy to get vaccinated. And we know that whether the goal is to discourage cigarette smoking, to encourage savings, to encourage work or education, to encourage people to engage in some health plan, if it is made easy, that can dramatically affect behavior. We often think that if we want to change behavior, the best thing to do is to push people in some way. But it's often better to think, why aren't they doing it anyway? And take away the obstacle. One way to do that is to make participation automatic, as in automatic enrollment in a savings plan or potentially in green energy. Another way is just to make it simpler, to make it easy. That's the E in the FEAST framework. The second, E gets the Olympic gold medal, by the way. If there was a behavioral economics Olympics, E would win gold. Silver would be won by the S for social. And the basic idea there is if you tell people what the social norm is, you can often increase behavior dramatically. To tell people that most people are doing this can often change behavior in the preferred direction. In one nation, there was a problem of excessive prescription of antibiotics by doctors, creating a risk of where people the antibiotics wouldn't work anymore because people use them too much. And the response was to tell the doctors who were the most likely to prescribe antibiotics that you are in the top % of antibiotic prescribers. The result was to reduce antibiotic prescriptions by doctors in that country by over 60,000 in a relatively short period. If people learn that they are in a small percentage of people who are engaging in, let's say, deviant behavior, they're not paying their taxes, then that is often a very successful nudge. It's invoking the social norm. With respect to the environment and sustainability in particular, we're learning that if people are informed that people are increasingly engaging in environmentally friendlier behavior, that can help save nations pollution and also help save nations money. That's the emerging rather than the majority social norm. The A in the FEAST framework, and I'm saving the best for last, the A is attractive. In some nations, the goal of responding to risks associated with COVID-19 has been promoted by making precautionary behavior more attractive. Now, in a pandemic, very little that's precautionary is attractive. But if social distancing or wearing masks or staying at home is tolerable rather than frightening and horrible, people are more likely to do it. Attractiveness means it has a kind of aesthetic, positive characteristic associated with it. And some young people have used this to good effect with respect to mask wearing. The T in the feast framework, and we're almost done, is for timely. And the basic idea behind the T is if you're going to give people a nudge, do it at exactly the right time. If you give people information about a decision they're going to make in December, if you give that information to them in July, it might have no effect at all. In fact, if you give people information the night before they're going to make a decision, rather than the hour before they're going to make a decision, it might have no impact at all. And in fact, we observe with respect to various forms of precautionary behavior associated with COVID-19, we observe a great deal of timeliness. When people are about to enter a store, for example, they are informed that mask wearing is obligatory. Okay, you have now the East part of the feast framework. And in some nations, EAST is the relevant acronym. Easy, attractive, social, timely. But many prefer feast, and I promised I saved the best for last. The F in the feast framework refers to fun. And the basic idea is if an intervention leads to behavior that people regard as fun, if they laugh a little bit or smile, they're more likely to do it, even if it isn't entirely fun to do. In some countries, the response to COVID-19 is organized by the following phrase: humor over rumor. Humor over rumor. Where the idea is sometimes rumors are damaging, and if you make a joke about the preposterous nature of the rumor, you can help people. It's also the case that in some nations, the fear and anger which various social problems introduce has successfully counteracted by a sense that the response will have a laugh and a smile in it. It will have some fun in it. Now, I've given you some abstractions here. Let me give you some examples. If people learn in nations where there's an interest in encouraging more consumption of vegetables and less consumption of meat, that it's healthy to eat more vegetables, you do get an increase in consumption of vegetables. But if people learn that eating vegetables is fun because they're delicious, that creates a bigger impact than people learning that eating vegetables is healthy. Making consumption of vegetables fun has a bigger impact. I noticed a few months ago that a large company, you may be familiar with it, Amazon, sells certain products in what they call frustration-free packaging. Frustration-free packaging. So that when you buy maybe a razor, you don't have to deal with plastic and wire and a complicated box. It's right there, frustration-free packaging. And I really like frustration-free packaging. I like it sufficiently that I did a little research about what it was about. And actually, it's about the environment. It doesn't have solid waste in it. There's no plastic. There's no wire. It's an environmentally better way of mailing products. But Amazon markets this as frustration-free packaging, not as environmentally preferred packaging. Frustration-free is fun. Environmentally preferred is virtuous. Fun can often be a successful nudge. Anything that can be done that can make people laugh and have a sense of pleasure and delight can be more effective than something that makes people grim. Okay, that's the feast framework. Now we're going to shift to my last topic. I know a focus here, which is sludge. I have a number for you. The United States government imposes 11 billion hours of paperwork burdens on the American public. 11 billion hours. These are hours imposed on doctors and nurses, patients and students, truck drivers and small companies, large companies and educators, people who are trying to start businesses, people who are trying to get permits, people who are trying to get visas, people who are trying to make their lives better in ways large and small. That 11 billion hours in paperwork burdens just scratches the surface, because the 11 billion hours are not only a time tax on people who have to navigate sludge, they often are a very serious obstacle to people who are trying to get the relevant benefit or avoid the relevant burden. And because the sludge is there, they might ultimately give up. With your indulgence, I'll tell you a personal story from just a few days ago, if I may. And the story is that in my country, vaccine boosters are now available. And I tried to make an appointment for a vaccine booster. The online form for the relevant place was so complicated and confusing that I couldn't fill it out. I'm a lawyer and I couldn't fill it out. It had too many hard questions. It asked me questions involving my employment history and my cards and things that I did not have easy access to. So I thought I'd go to the relevant place where the vaccine booster was available and ask them to help me fill out the form. I asked them to help me. There were 5 good people there, and they looked at me and said, "No, you have to fill out the form." I said, "The form's very hard. I'm a lawyer and I can't figure it out." And they looked at me and said, "Sorry, you have to fill out the form." And I responded, having worked on sludge for the last year, by saying, with some combination of humor and despair, I said, "We're talking about people's health here. This is a vaccine booster. If I can't fill out the form, then a lot of people probably can't fill out the form. People are going to get sick." And so one of the 5 people smiled and said, "I'll help you." And she took the sludge away. She made it very easy. That's a personal story. The take-up rate in the United States of programs that are designed to help people who are poor is often between 40 and 60%. Pause over that, if you would. 40 and 60%, which means about half of the eligible population often isn't benefiting from something that could save their lives, give them education, train them to perform a job, help them to start a company. They aren't benefiting. Now let's think a little bit about why sludge is so damaging. The first point is, even if human beings were perfectly rational choosers, they would often be defeated by sludge. If you keep in mind the time tax that sludge imposes, often people will rationally decide, I don't have 14 hours to fill out that form, or I do have enough time, but I can't figure out how to do it. If the question is whether people should go to some place that's far away, maybe when they have small children or an elderly relative to take care of, they might think rationally, I can't do that. Which means we don't have to speak about imperfect choosers to recognize that sludge will be a problem. But if we return to the first part of these remarks where I spoke about our species, if we know that human beings suffer or sometimes benefit from present bias, people might think, I'll navigate the sludge tomorrow. but tomorrow never comes. Or they might think, I will do it, but the status quo, which involves doing my job or doing my schooling, it takes precedence. Or they might think optimistically, sure, the sludge is something I'll handle. I'm not worried about it. But that's unrealistic optimism. They will never handle it. Now, these behavioral findings are complemented by the problem of scarcity. And here is the saddest part of all. It's, I think, profoundly illuminating as well as sad, that often the people who have to face sludge are the very people who are in the worst position to handle sludge. There's a quotation from an elderly man in a book about administrative burdens. And their words are on the page, they're not recorded, but they're so vivid, it's as if you can hear them in your ear. And it's a man in his 80s, and he's speaking with some combination of mischief and a sense of humor and a sense of disbelief about the sludge. He's entitled to benefits. I don't remember if it's from a private or public institution, but benefits that he needs, he's entitled to them. And he says, when I was 50, I could have done this. I could have filled out these complicated forms. I'm 87 years old now. Now you're asking me to fill out the forms? Now, what's true of people who are in their 80s is true in one or another respect of people who are disabled, who are physically ill, who suffer from depression or anxiety, who are poor and struggling with a very difficult economic situation, or in some societies, the disproportionate weight of sludge is imposed on women. And since women are often taking care of children, as well as managing a household, to ask women also to bear the burden of sludge is to ensure that the sludge will basically prevent them from getting what they have a right to. Which is why the problem of equity in society, whatever we think equity means exactly, it might mean help for the elderly, it might be help for the sick. Whatever we think of the problem of equity, it is compounded by the existence of sludge. In my country, there is a very recent report from the Executive Office of the President on the problem of equity. And the second finding in the report, this is just from a few months ago, the second finding is that administrative burdens or sludge compound inequity, which is to say that the problem of sludge is often a problem for all of us in terms of economic growth, opportunity, education, employment, but it's often a particular problem for the most vulnerable of us. Okay, what are we going to do about it? The first thing we need is a sludge audit in which we get some understanding in various institutions of how much sludge there is. Sludge audits can be quite formal. The 11 billion hours comes from a formal sludge audit where we know our Department of Education, our Department of Agriculture, involving farmers, our Department of Transportation, involving truck drivers, we know where the sludge comes from. It can be informal. You can do a sludge in your own audit in your own institution in 2 weeks by asking how much sludge do administrators and educators and students and doctors and nurses bear. Sludge audits are a first step towards sludge reduction. The second thing we need is something like a war on sludge, in which we ask in every case, are the burdens of sludge justified by the benefits of sludge? In some cases, to require a waiting period before people get some benefit is justified. But should the waiting period be 5 days or a week, or should it be 3 months or 8 months? Sometimes it's 3 months or 8 months when it should be a week or 2 weeks. We might have a form that has 7 pages, and the question is, could you accomplish the same goal with a form that is 1 page? Often, governments have found that reducing the length and burden of forms is not merely a way of saving people's time. It's a way of saving people's lives. One of the few good things about the COVID-19 pandemic, there aren't many good things, but one of the good things has been it has concentrated people's minds on the problem of sludge. And often, people not at the highest levels, people at the low levels, have said, can we eliminate sludge so that people can get a driver's license, or can get some economic help, or can get health benefits? And public officials all over the world have reduced sludge amidst the pandemic and are thinking now, as things are getting better in some countries, should we make the elimination of sludge permanent? Or is this something that's just for a pandemic? And in many cases, the conclusion is permanent is the right answer. Okay, I am basically done. To recapitulate, we have now, I hope, a sense of 3 new behavioral findings involving scarcity, sludge, and emerging social norms. We have a sense of human beings and how we depart from perfect rationality. We are imperfect choosers. We are not usually irrational. We are just boundedly rational. We know that nudges are sometimes a response to imperfect rationality, whether educative or architectural. We know that the feast framework helps organize responses to behavioral biases, where the most important parts of the feast framework are the E for easy, the S for social, and perhaps the F for fun. We know that a new frontier, an uncharted territory for behaviorally informed policy is understanding and reducing sludge. We know that sludge would be a serious problem for perfect choosers. For imperfect choosers, it's often a devastating problem. I want to conclude by asking a question, which is always a good thing, I think, for human beings to ask ourselves, which is, what is the most precious thing that we are blessed to have? Of all the wonderful things that each of us has in life, what is the one thing that's the most precious of all? There are many good answers to that question, and we each may have our own personal answer. But in 2021, where so many of us have either suffered terrible losses in our families, in our communities, or if we haven't suffered them personally, we've read about them and observed them closely. I think in 2021, the answer to the question, what's the one thing that we're most blessed to have, is potentially clear. And it is this: time. Let's find, shall we, ways to give our brothers and sisters more of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sunstein. Very illuminating as usual. You'll be pleased to know we've started a sludge audit in Pakistan. We've started analyzing sludge in every activity of the government. We started publishing papers on that. I hope you're getting them. We're supposed to be sending them to you. Love your comments on those. But let me ask you a very simple question. I know you're very short of time. Very simple question. Yes, we are doing a sludge audit, and yes, we are trying to publicize it, talk about it. How do we get to nudge the government? Our biggest problem is our government is too distant from us. We can't nudge the government. And the second issue is global governance, because we in Pakistan feel, in smaller countries, we feel more the edge of global governance because they're constantly inventing new rules for us. We are just taking on a fund program. Then we got the World Bank and various other donors imposing prescriptions on us. How do we nudge them? Is that something that you've thought about, global governance and nudges, and our governance and nudges? Thank you.
Yes, I have. Thank you for the kind words and thank you for the questions. I'm now working in the Biden administration, and sludge is something, as noted, that the Biden administration is very concerned about. And the reason the government is reducing sludge is that it believes that its own goals would be promoted through sludge reduction. So if public officials think, for example, that it's very important to ensure that people who are entitled to certain benefits get them, then public officials will ask, how do we do that? And if there's a concept, sludge reduction, that can help, then it promotes their own goals. So to think, what is the relevant goal of public officials, and to ask, would sludge reduction promote that goal? The answer is frequently yes. And then public officials say, well, now I have an instrument, and maybe it's not a very expensive instrument that I can use to achieve that goal. I'll give one example where public officials have been very keenly interested in sludge reduction, that if you want to help poor people get educated, sometimes education is very expensive and they can't afford it in places where they have to pay, at least for higher education. Studies show that there are two things you can do to increase educational opportunity for poor people. One is give them more money, so increase the amount of available money. Another is simplify the form they have to fill out to get the money that they're already entitled to. And it turns out that simplifying the form has the same impact on educational opportunity as giving them a lot more money. And governments respond to that by saying, we'd rather simplify the form than increase the amount of money, because that will burden taxpayers. So that promotes the government's own end. I've worked with the United Nations and also with the World Health Organization in terms of global governance on these issues. And the United Nations, the Secretary General personally issued a guidance document on behavioral science just a few months ago. And the concepts of sludge has a prominent place. In fact, I believe just yesterday, the behavioral science group at the United Nations released a policy statement on administrative burdens and sludge. I think administrative burdens is in the title. And global institutions are now quite focused on sludge reduction, both in order to do their own jobs better. So the United Nations itself has more sludge than would be ideal. If you've worked with the United Nations, you've probably seen that. And the Secretary General wants to reduce it. And to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations is aware that sometimes the obstacle is sludge. If you're talking about protecting water quality, it might be that for people to get clean water, they have to navigate a system that's very confusing, and sludge reduction can help.
Well, we've got a hard constraint that Professor Sunstein has to leave at 6:30. So I'll take 3 quick questions and I'll come to you, Professor Sunstein, to round up. Anybody wants to ask a question? Okay, fair enough. Parvez, first Parvez Hudboy. Parvez Hudboy is a famous scientist from MIT, so let him ask a question.
Thank you for an excellent lecture. I learned a lot from it. It seems as if behavioral psychology is getting to the point of being a science. If it is a science, then what you've just told us ought to be translatable into computer code, an algorithm with some predictive power. Are you aware of examples where predictions have been made and where they have been reasonably successful? That's one question. The other question is that you happen to be addressing people in a part of Pakistan where many dozens of polio workers have been killed and have been shot and killed. We thought of ourselves as being irrational in that, but then when we look at Middle America, when we look at the resistance to COVID-19, the anti-vaxxers, then the thought comes to mind that perhaps this is something quite universal. So can you correlate for us why this resistance happens so universally here in Pakistan, in the United States, and now in Europe, as we are seeing from riots over there?
Thank you for these questions. So in behavioral science, definitely the goal is to have testable hypotheses and various findings, for example, that automatic enrollment will increase participation rate. That's a testable hypothesis, and it's tested. Another testable hypothesis is that if you inform people of the existing social norm, you'll have an increase in behavior, and that's been frequently tested. It's often been found to be true. There are circumstances in which it isn't true, which enables us to refine the hypothesis and get clear on the boundary conditions. To use nudges or behavioral findings as part of algorithms, that's also something that people are keenly interested in. It's early stages. I have a testable hypothesis which is being confirmed, and it's behavioral now, which is at approximately this time of day, my dogs will start barking. And you see that the hypothesis is, you do not see, but you hear that the hypothesis is confirmed, that dogs will bark when they are hungry, and human beings will stay where they are defaulted unless they have good reason to believe that it's not in their interest to, in which case you'll see opting out. In terms of the universality of at least some degree of resistance, it varies across communities and nations, some degree of resistance to, let's say, mandates associated with COVID-19. I think here's a behavioral finding that is findable throughout the world, and it's gotten a little lost in academic circles. I think it's really important. It's called reactance. And the idea is that when people are told to do something, they often will rebel. Not necessarily, or not mostly, because what they're being told to do is something they hate, but by virtue of being commanded to do it. So that there's something in the human spirit that strikes out sometimes when told you must do this. Now, if you have a combination of people not wanting to do the relevant thing and being told they have to do the relevant thing, then you can have very vigorous, let's say, reactance. And I think what you're describing is reactance. And there's some empirical behavioral work on what to do to reduce or overcome reactance. I'll give a little maybe hypothesis, which is that reactance is reduced when the people who are prone to show reactance believe that people like them will not show reactance. So if they think that the relevant behavior, let's say it's buckling your seatbelts, is something that people like them typically do, so it's not an imposition from some elite or some demographic group that's not like them, that it's a shared endeavor in which we're all participating, then reactance can be reduced at least and possibly eliminated.
Hello, Professor. My name is Sara, and I'm an early researcher from Karachi. I want to start with an example of both sludge and nudge from my country. In May 2021, the Punjab police shared a tweet that said that according to Section 325 of criminal law in Pakistan, whoever attempts to commit suicide and survives shall be jailed up to 1 year. This is supposed to be suicide prevention in Pakistan. I mean, it's really laughable. So my question is that in Pakistan, we have this huge informal economy because, of course, it has many upsides. People tend to hide their information when they feel that the institutions are predatory. So how can we nudge the informal economy to be included in formal economy? Thank you.
That's a great and very important question. And I think my best answer is to say I'd have to learn much more before giving an opinion. But I'll be a little reckless and give an opinion without knowing more. So one question is, why exactly are people not joining the formal economy now? Do we know that there are 3 reasons? Or is there one reason that's a dominant reason? If so, then we'll have a clue about what we should do or what ought to be done now that isn't being done now. The second thing to say, I'm going to say 3 things, is there some difficulty that's concrete that joining the formal economy introduces and that people are aware of? If so, then reduce or eliminate that difficulty. The third is to take advantage, if it's possible, of those who have joined the formal economy in the last year, and to try to create a cascade based on recent developments in favor of joining the formal economy on the part of people who have done it and are glad they did. So cascades often materialize surprisingly. They can be good cascades or bad ones. They might involve, for example, healthier behavior or lawful behavior. They can be dangerous, as in form of violent behavior or risk-taking behavior. And the key characteristic of cascades is that they involve people learning from one another. And if people can learn very easily that joining the formal economy is what's increasingly happening, even if it's not mostly happening, if it's increasingly happening, that could help. I'll tell you something that I'm reminded of. I know very little, but I know enough to know that the problem you described isn't a small problem. President Obama, when faced with large problems, and whether you love him or don't love him doesn't matter. This I found very helpful. In the face of large problems, he would often say, better is good. Meaning you can't solve a large problem tomorrow or maybe this year, but better is good. So if you can reduce it even a little bit, that's a very good thing to have done.
Any others? Last question.
Good evening, Professor. I am Muhammad Imran Khan from Applied Economics Research Center, Karachi. My question is, would it not be an unjust to those who deserve to access any facility if we remove sludge? Because it differentiates between the deserving and undeserving people. So whoever is deserving will fulfill all the requirements that is needed to access the facility. Thank you, sir.
Okay, it's a great question. So thank you particularly for it. So some sludge is designed to ensure program integrity, we might call it, where access to a facility is limited to a certain number of people. And if you eliminate the sludge, it might be that you open up access to people who aren't entitled to be there. So too, if you have a benefit program that eliminates sludge, it might be that people are getting benefits who don't deserve them. And that's a very serious problem. So the optimal level of sludge is frequently not 0. And the point of a sludge audit is to figure out how much sludge there is and to see if it's excessive. In many domains, what emerges is that the level of sludge is much higher than what's necessary to ensure security or integrity. So while people have to spend 4 hours on sludge you could get the same benefit if they spent 20 minutes on sludge. Or if people have to wait 4 weeks to get something, that's not necessary. They could wait 1 week, and that 3-week period might make all the difference in their lives. So I can report that in governments with which I'm familiar, sludge reduction has been possible without jeopardizing the goals that sludge is legitimately designed to promote.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Sunstein. We'll let you go exactly on time. We will keep sending you our sludge documents, our sludge audit from Pakistan. Please give us your thoughts and comments, guide us. We are trying to do a complete sludge audit of Pakistan across every city and across Pakistan. And we're trying to get our government's attention to see if we can remove some of those hurdles. You'd be amazed at what we can cook up. You would be absolutely amazed at what we can cook up. And I would like to also inform you that sludge is used as a way to game the system. The keepers of the sludge are using sludge to collect bribes. And that's another side of the problem that you should look at, because here they force paperwork on us because part of the paperwork is to collect a bribe. So for example, sometimes it's easier to get something done with a bribe than through the work our way through the sludge. Anyways, thank you very much, Professor Sunstein. It's great to see you again. We'll call on you sometime again. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's been a great honor.